Welcome. Great way to spend a Saturday morning. I am CO Ebert, also known as Owain Drake, also known as that really hot non-binary specialist. But try to focus on what I'm saying. I know I'm cute, but by the way, talking the way I am now is how you get yourself a tenured position, and also swearing like a sailor the way I am this morning during your lectures is another way to get taken very seriously as an academic. So today's topic is why we both love and hate murdering God, the strange hot cold relationship humankind has with deicide. Just before we begin, it's part of 3 lecture series that I'm going to do. One on the so-called hero's journey, how it has positives and negatives, how it holds people back, so slightly more narrow subject area. And then one on J.R. Tolkien about being perhaps not so great of an author, but almost undebatably Tolkien and his sons and the people around him are very early brand manager. And just as an anecdote, for some reason I thought to do this lecture first because I had a really busy week. I thought this topic would be easy because it was so broad I could go wherever I wanted with it. And no, I realized I was an idiot for thinking this would be easy to put together. Anyway, without further ado, so what are we talking about? What we're talking about is that I don't know how to advance my slides. Hey, why are you? This isn't good. Zoom really sucks. Just technical difficulties, folks. Why are there we go. Okay, so what is the framework for today's lecture? The framework is today we're going to be talking about what people have believed over time. Science and history can't prove technically that anything doesn't exist. There's some logical falsehoods with that argument that I don't have to represent here because they're very well articulated elsewhere. But if you're going to go with that framework, yeah, you can't prove a given God doesn't exist, but you cannot prove one God doesn't exist as much as you cannot prove another God doesn't exist, or a fairy or a leprechaun. But we're not talking about what actually exists out there, if anything, or doesn't exist out there. We're talking about what people believed. So if you are a person of faith, you can always say that the moment people begin to believe this is when revelation occurred or re-revelation occurred, because some faiths have a tradition that part of their faith was once known, it was lost to man, and when the belief reoccurs in the historical record, it's the divine being re-revealing itself. The other disclaimer, there's not any privileging in this lecture. So Christianity, Islam, and Judaism do not enjoy the special privileging they do elsewhere. They're treated with the same level of respect as any other religion: Hinduism, ancient paganism, Satanism, for that matter. And also, all unprovable scientific beliefs are treated equivalently in this lecture. So belief in the law of attraction or belief in magic, we're talking about what people believe. So if you feel you might get triggered by the 3 Abrahamic religions not being given a especially high place above others, you should tune this out. And if you also could be triggered by Yahweh and Allah and Jesus, and or even Hindu gods being spoken about as if they're, for purposes of belief, the same thing as a fictional character in media, or the same thing as a god in a religion other than your own, tune out. It's not my goal to frustrate you and leave you with a migraine on a beautiful Saturday. And I'm just going to do one more technical check, and then we'll begin. So that's the framework. So what is a god anyway? Well, the word God comes from the ancient Indo-European word Godan. I don't really know if that's how it's said, but there's how it's spelled. You can see it on the screen. It's a Proto-Germanic word, potentially meaning libation, like wine or oil that you would pour out for an offering. In the movies, it's blood, but that's actually pretty rare. Invocation, meaning a ceremony or wording used to call a god, or a spirit in a burial. And over time, that becomes the word not only for God, but any God, because God is sometimes a name and a title. Note for references in the Bible, when you see the word God, it usually is a stand-in for El. which to some people is another name for Yahweh, to students of ancient Canaanite folklore is a separate god from Yahweh who was his father. And when you see the Lord, it's usually a stand-in for Yahweh. The ancient Baal, one of Yahweh's rival gods, actually also means Lord. That god is really called Hadad, and Allah simply means the God. But El also was a word in ancient Canaanite and Ugaritic, for example, that could be the name of God, but could also be the word for God. So it's very common for the God who's considered the one true God for their name and title to be the same thing. And sometimes when you're getting translated into another language, the name for a rival God becomes the rival's name in that language. And another final trigger warning is we are going to be talking about the religion of the ancient Israelites at the point of henotheism, which is where biblical authors at various times were to state that believing there was more than one God, but they should primarily worship Yahweh or only worship Yahweh, but that other gods existed. Apologeticists deny that that's what the Old Testament says, but this is pretty much what all scholars and historians agree that it said. Again, maybe those people who believed there were other gods besides Yahweh were wrong, but it is what they believed. And so we will be talking about that. Apologetics, if you're not familiar with it, is usually in religion or philosophy where someone says, I know it doesn't look this way, but we're going to explain why we're right, even though someone has done a great criticism why we're wrong. The problem with apologetics is it starts with a conclusion. In my opinion, I don't have much respect for it. It's an inflated version of Star Trek nerds talking about why there's not a lore contradiction. So this is a concept from Bart Ehrman, and let's talk about gods in general before talking about the god. And I don't think my pointy point is on the screen, but if you could, top of it says ultimate god, and then the great gods, local deities, daemonia, second to last here, which is from what the word demon arises, but it's doers of things, the spirits or energies that carry out the laws of nature. And then finally, divine humans. And under that, you would have regular humans, starting with the king if this pyramid went down, and then regular people. So in other words, the ancients did not think of there being this wide gap between mortals and gods. It was a continuum. And there's a lot of evidence that in Bart Ehrman's work on Christianity that that's actually kind of similar to how early Christians and Jews also viewed things. But there was this idea of a continuum. And because of that, sometimes divine beings had a lot of very attributes that we might find very mortal today. But because it was a continuum, you could fall really wherever you wanted. Gods could have a birth and a death, an origin and end. They didn't have to exist all the way backward into eternity to be a god or not end. They did not certainly have to be completely good. They could possess a gender, even though gender is arguably an entirely mortal quality. It exists to reproduce, which is a workaround for death. And for our idea of infallible, immortal gods, probably seems incompatible with them. Although I realize there are a lot of people who have a modern philosophical concept of divine feminine and divine masculine. There is one thing that begins with gods, and that is there is an otherness to them. And it's not just sacred versus secular. Very early on, there's this idea there's an otherness that you can't understand about the gods. If you read the Bible, for instance, Yahweh's otherness and even alienness is stretched into how he is at least intellectually incomprehensible to. This is even something that we see sometimes extended to kings and queens. Because remember, at one point in time, the king was part of pyramids that ordered how the world was supposed to be. So ancient gods sometimes possessed immortality and control over natural elements. They had an influence over human fate, but were sometimes governed by fate. Later on, as we move from animism into theism, they sometimes are personifications of universal forces. Sometimes the ancients were very conscious that they were personifications. The Celts famously laughed at how anthropomorphic the Greek and Roman gods were, at least anecdotally, we're told that. And they can demand worship. Sometimes the point of the worship is to curry favor or keep away wrath. Sometimes they have specific domains. As we start to move from animism to theism, we see gods defined to domains, but not as strictly as they would be, say, a god has a very particular alignment and domain in D&D. It was never that strict in ancient. Um, there's this idea, what is a god? Like there's this idea, and I'm trying to go through these slides quickly because some of these are very, very, very thick at other points in time. There's this idea that there are these forces that the gods either command or partially command that varies of this all-pervading force, and this all-pervading force later being subsumed inside the idea of a ruler, a creator god, will play an idea in the emergence of the concept with monotheism. Oh, and I should have said we're not just talking about the origins of God. We're talking about why people would think they couldn't be killed, or threatened by why they would be, or maybe might like it. That's the whole point of the lecture. But I hope you figured that out. So a lot of ancient Chinese thoughts, there was the Tao or the Jian, which was cosmic order itself, which pervaded not only into the order of the seasons, but into social order and moral order, as well as those ideas became more strict. The Sumerian gods had these things called the Tablets of Destiny, which commanded the Met, which was a force above magic. Ea or Enki, the god of magic, could only command magic. His brother Enlil could command the May. Magic could basically adjust everything within the framework of the universe, within its constants, while not going against the constants. The May would actually set what the constants were. So it meant you had read, write, edit privileges on the constants of reality. And that disparagement between Enki and Ea, for that matter, is why Enki has to be so tricky when helping mankind survive the flood. And in the biblical version of that, Enki and Enlil, who are rivals, get merged into one god, which is why the biblical flood narrative is so confusing. The Fates, who are sometimes personified, or the Moira, sometimes had to listen to the gods, but sometimes even the gods were bound by them. And even in the Sumerian version, before someone rightfully took control of the Tablets of Destiny, the early primordial gods were running around doing stuff. So the relationship between the gods and these immutable forces was pretty fluid. So as people started to think about, like, as we said, at the top of that hierarchy was usually a one god. What are some early notions of this, right? That might sound kind of alien to us today. There's the creator of the source. It's often a primordial entity. And since some of the earliest versions, the creator of the source is called the source because they provide the source material or stuff for reality. They don't create. Tiamat in Sumerian mythology and Ymir in Norse mythology are carved up by the early gods. Their bodies used to make the worlds. And then in other things, the gods that were El in Canaanite mythology, or Enki and Enlil in Babylonian myth, which were still around, they're part of both Sumerian and Babylonian myth, create and order the universe and pass the kingship on to someone else. It's the same thing in Egyptian mythology. So a lot of the earliest notions of the creator were not based in the Australian Aboriginal and in Native American indigenous traditions. We see that the creator usually passes kingship on to someone else. They're not the one ruling and ordering the universe. That would only be later. There's the parent, like On in Celtic, or Gaia in Greek mythology, or Atum in Egyptian belief. He was a boy, but he gave birth to everything. He could procreate without a lady, just like there's ladies that can't procreate without dudes if you're a god. So, and they gave birth to everything, but they're a nurturing parent. But as we see monotheism emerge, this parent idea starts to merge away for this idea of the king. And the idea of God as a king who cannot be questioned and gives rules and orders, and questioning them is heretical and how dare you. That really worked well for monotheism with statecraft. You see it with Zeus, Yahweh, Odin, Marduk, sometimes in Babylonian, is reinterpreted as a local god who's a king. And usually they're not the first gods, though. They didn't create everything, and they're not bidirectionally eternal always. They came into existence, which is a thing later. Bidirectional eternity, having always existed without origin, is kind of a modern yardstick criteria for creator. They maintain order, but they weren't the first creators. The king's role is to govern and enforce. And then there's the interesting one. There's the dreamer. We'll talk about Immanuel Kant a little bit later. Brahma is a good version of this. It's this idea that all reality is a dream in God's mind. And Brahma is interpreted variously in Eastern thought. Sometimes he is very consciously and intentionally making this dream in a focused meditation. Otherwise, he has no control over it. To early mention of media is the Elder Scrolls universe, where the Godhead is not conscious at all, is in the middle of a fever dream. Carl Jung even famously, in answer to Job, postulated that Yahweh might be this way, and that like he didn't need to be fully conscious. He was basically just an id, sheer pleasure principle, avoid pain, seek pleasure, no ego, no I, no super ego in relation to others, because prior to there being anything else, he didn't need it. It was unnecessary. That's why he freaks out so much, according to Jung, at the end of Job, asking Job all these unanswerable questions, but I am kind of just displaying fear because he's afraid of Job's ability to grow and change. There's another thing we'll talk about. Are gods mutable or not? Do you need to be immutable to be a god, unchanging, and or to be the god? A lot of people say that that's necessary. And the interesting thing is, Jung postulates that Christ comes not to save man, but to save God. So that God can become mortal and die and become fully conscious, have an id and a superego, so to speak. Not that I think Freud is right, but just to keep things simple, because everyone knows what those are. And what's interesting is that Lucifer in that becomes this reluctant being to be like, my God, whom I love so much, is not conscious. I must help him become so. So I've got to do all this stuff. So answer to Job is a very interesting part of this. So what this is what may interest you, right? So what are, and we'll talk about the origins, what are the modern taste buds and early modern ones for what a god has? There's the omnis, omniscience, all see. God possesses complete and infinite knowledge as well as sight everywhere. Although if you have all knowledge of all time everywhere, you don't really need sight because there's nothing to observe because everything's already in there. But this raises the paradox of knowledge and free will. Does God know the choices everyone will make? And again, this is God. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Does the Godhead set everything up and take their hands off, or do they guide everything? And even if you allow free will, if you know how everything's going to play out, doesn't that mean that you made choices at the moment of creation that, sure, I'll create you with this free will, but your free will make this choice. And without free will, can love genuinely be given? How can love exist without some kind of informed consent, without some kind of free will? Omnipotence, all powerful. And we'll get into that. What does that mean? Does a God require unlimited power, or is it enough to be God of a given universe if you can do anything a mortal can conceive of? Like, does the power limit have to go on forever? And then is God bound by logic? Can God create a boulder that he or she or they or it can't lift? They can, there's something they can't do. Either way, there's something they can't do. Right? If they can't create a condition they can't later override, that is a limit. Or are they not bound by logic? Do they set up the rules of logic so logic doesn't apply to them? And then do they experience time linearly or not? And we'll get into some other things of transcendence during eminence on another slide. Omnibenevolence. The God destroys a city. Is it murder? Is the God guilty of murder, or are the residents of the city guilty of sin? Right? Is everything that God does inherently good simply because it's done by a God? And this brings up the Euthyphro dilemma, which is the one about the city. Like, is something good because God wills it, or does God will it because it's good? And this goes back to ideas of essential goodness and badness. Of a Godhead will ultimately balance it out, so you should do good, so you get rewarded in the end. When they balance everything, which is nice, but then you get into some problems because good and evil are by nature arbitrary, unless you say that the God's standard, the greater God's standard of good and evil, are the ultimate standard. But then you're following rules, right? And following rules or being obedient isn't inherently good or bad. What if you're following a rule that's bad, or being obedient in a way that hurts people? and it's Kant versus Mill, utilitarianism versus Kant's moral philosophy. Is it done when you create harm and create damage or not? And so without a God, or without a God who has ultimate standard, there may be no reward or punishment. But the bright side of that is you are doing good for its own purpose. You're not in it for a paycheck. But there's a lot of problems with that. And also early gods, Ahura Mazda was the first god in Zoroastrianism to be all good. And this is occurring around the time that the Old Testament is wrapping up. So Yahweh in his earliest version is the author of all good and evil. He's not all good. And good isn't just the absence or shadow of evil. Ahura Mazda in the 300 to 600 BC, as Zoroastrianism is forming, or the first god that's all good. And there was this Greek unknown god who they thought was the prime mover that created everything, that was one of the first gods to wrap up both the creator and divine order together. And the monotheistic God that starts to come together as Ahura Mazda's omnibenevolence, and the cult of Yahweh being the state religion through Christianity of the Roman Empire, and the Greek unknown God, who's both the creator and the orderer, sometimes keeping his hands on the till the whole time as he's letting go. Only then is the concept of any kind of omnipotent, infallible Godhead as you know it born. And even then, it probably took till about 1500 for that to become what a huge swath of the population believed. There's a famous story where there's a bishop asked a commoner, what are your thoughts on God? And he said, he's a decent old chap, and I think he's pretty great. Well, what about all the things he does? Oh, what is he able to do? And of course there were commoners who had an idea like this about God, like these omnis, omni this, omni that, even if they didn't know those words. But for it to be widespread, it's only probably been about 500 years that the concept of God that you were raised on existed or was born, at least in the human world. Soul and so a couple of other things. Do you need the omnis? What if you can create a universe or even a multiverse? But that's all you can do. You can't create an omniverse. So a multiverse is a multiverse containing various universes where all possible variations of that universe play out, but of course only things that can happen that don't defy the logic or constants of that universe can play out in the multiverse. In other words, nowhere, if we're part of the multiverse, is there a universe where there's a whole number between 6 and 7 because it defies the logic rules of our universe. But in an omniverse, there could be a different multiverse where the universe is where that happened. So I would think if you can create and run a multiverse, but there are things above you that that can even control, an omniverse, I think you still qualify as a godhead just for running an omniverse. Do you need to be sole and alone and have no origin? Why is that necessary to qualify as a god? Right? I understand it has an emotional resonance, but but when we look at some unusual concepts of God in myth and media as we go through here, you don't necessarily have to be the only thing to be not just a god, but to be legitimately, at least in the right relative position, called the god, at least relatively, if not ultimately. Can a god change? Do you have to be fixed? If you don't change or cannot by your nature change, is that a limit? And do gods have to be unlimited? But if you want that and they are immutable, they're kind of limited. Is mutability imperfection? And Christian theology actually has this very interesting new thing called open theism that suggests God. It's a new Protestant theology that's, not everything is rigid, even in the big three religions and all their branches, that God's nature changes dynamically in relation to creation. And it's seen as a more better way for God to express agape, unconditional love. Divine mutability allows for a more real relationship with creation. And then there's perfection, forms, and eccentricity, whatever. Plato's theory of forms argues that perfection exists in an abstract, mutable realm of divine forms up above us, that like our world is a reflection of that. Then he goes into stuff about how stories and narratives are a reflection of the reflection, us being the first reflection. And but he arbitrarily says things like goodness, beauty, masculinity. It's almost as if categories, which we created categories by putting things in them and can change them. But it's almost like he thinks there are these category lenses of which our immutable natures are made. But he's very picky because you have to have an arbiter, because not all categories or forms or archetypes are primary, and whose category is right. So the arbiter is usually that unknown God, again, that the Greeks were coming up with, who is one of the parents of our modern concept of God, the Greek unknown God. St. Paul, by the way, directly claims and says when he goes into one of the cities, when he's preaching in the Bible, I have the unknown God you're looking for. And in fact, I know his name. So the idea that the unknown God was influential in Christianity is undebatable. And this is in one of the nine writings by Paul that even non-religious scholars like Herman agree probably was written by Paul. Doesn't mean that everything it says is true, but that it was written by Paul. And anyway, this arbiter goes on to this thing. This goes back into the divine mind idea. There's these things called phenomenon, which are things that emerge out of another thing. You could think of and noumena, which is the thing itself. But like phenomenon would be the table we experience. The molecules and atoms might be to someone the noumena. Then you go down further into the quarks. The noumena is the thing at its base level, even when it's unobserved. And Immanuel Kant says that everything at its base level is a thought in the mind of God, but you can rely on the phenomenon like the chair always being there to sit in because God is the best arbiter. To make phenomenon and noumena simple, you think of a pop singer and a stadium and a ticket and the love for that singer all being ingredients, either phenomenally emergent ingredients that make it another level of phenomenon of the moment of a concert and all the physical and all the things that occur temporally there, and even the feelings you have in them. So phenomenon is the thing that merges out of something else. An appearance. That's why ghostly phenomenon are called that. It's an appearance. Appears, and on some level is the real experience. We talked about existentialism says that there's no ultimate good or evil, suggesting that absolute perfection allows for more moral relativity and personal freedom, but it also means more personal accountability. You have to do your best to be good, even though there's no ultimate good, which is not always easier. And you're doing good or evil, I guess, for its own sake. Is God transcendent or eminent? Is God all things, right? Or is God separate from creation? Because creation is observable and has limits, and a lot of people want God to not have limits. So they don't want him to be part of creation. And creation, material creation, is regarded as a lower order. So a transcendent God is not part of that. An immanent God is everything from the conscious God to just the universal force, or the one is all mind in the Buddhist idea of separate minds being an illusion. And then there are transcendent and immanent gods who are both part of everything, but there's also a chunk of God that exists without that. An objective or a subjective God, right? Everything that exists objectively comes with limitation and finitude. We can measure it, it'll go away someday, it has limits, but it is there for everyone. Subjective things, such as your love for your favorite band, or the feeling you get when you eat chocolate, which are qualia, they can potentially be unlimited, right? Not have limits. But the cost of subjectivity is that maybe it exists in a very real way for you, but not for everybody. And if you're trying to posit a God whose rules can't be questioned, and you're the one church of that God, you want God to be objective. And then there's this idea of, in this universal mind, why are we going through lessons of karma and cycles of incarnation? Are we just supposed to remerge with the Godhead, lose our individuality again? Same way, we're actually perfect, but we feel we're not perfect. We're learning lessons that we already know somewhere underneath the illusion of imperfection. Why are we doing it? Or is everything so that an error made by a rebellious angel or rebellious lower God can be undone? Why can't God just undo it? And if we're just putting everything back to the baseline, why are we doing it? Well, maybe for the universe experiencing itself, but why does a perfect universal mind need this epiphenomenon to experience itself? Or is the idea that we're being spun out to be divine and perhaps greater than God one day? Like God is trying to have us grow beyond him or her, or a Godhead is trying to have the constituent parts of this universe grow out. And if that's so apocryphal, the questions were asked by ancient philosophers who posited this idea. If a human parent or teacher is capable of looking forward to the day that their student exceeds them or their child does better than them, again, why are mortals capable of that, but gods are incapable of what seems like such a high-minded and unconditional love kind of thing? Wait, did we just go backwards? I think we did. Right. Okay. So here are some theologies that are worth mentioning from media before we get it. We're going to get to the killing scene. Elden Ring posits an interesting idea. It's the idea that the god known as the One Great fractured itself upon creation into things that, at least in the English version, are called outer gods. In the game, they're called the Frenzied Flame, the Greater Will, the Formless Mother, the God of Rod. And the Frenzied Flame aims to burn everything, including the other outer gods, and creating everyone into it quite violently, back into the One Great, to remerge with everything. The Frenzied Flame knows full well that it's not the totality of the original creator God. But the Greater Will has forgotten that it's only a fragment of God. So this fragmented God idea is very captured. The Elder Scrolls universe, again, is the dreamer god. The god had actually went into its sleeping state to go into creation due to some sort of trauma that it couldn't deal with. In the vernacular, God couldn't deal with his shit. May as well swear, since already this lecture topic is going to go up badly with some people. So creating reality as a dream in an attempt to process its grief. But the residents of this universe are trapped in repeating motifs. Like, for one thing, you can't ever evolve or attain enlightenment or heal your trauma past the source wound of the damaged Godhead, right? If trauma is the baseline of God, you can't heal beyond it. But they do have a workaround. It's called Kim. And if you can truly realize you're just part of the dream, you don't really exist, if you just realize that on your own, that you zero sum Scrolls universe and don't exist. But if you can hold that paradox and also insist that you exist at the same time, you can take control of the dream. And then there's a state beyond that called amaranth, where you can usurp the dreamer, which isn't because you want power, but because you might be able to spawn a creation without these recurring awful motifs or traumas, or at least maybe with fewer. That's actually implied in the Elder Scrolls universe. The one time where Amaranth is explored in the writings of Michael Kirkbride, the person that attains Amaranth they do better, not perfect. They choose to live the axiom of don't let perfect be the enemy of better. Simulation theory is mentioned here, that everything's a computer, in which case, I guess God is just the computer we're all running on. It's been explored elsewhere. I'm going to kind of just skip over it because I don't think it's that compelling. And then God is a role, and it's also not that it's just not that compelling, but it's been talked about to death, and you probably talked about it with your friends. I don't think we can be passionate. God is a role or position. God isn't a singular eternal being, but is a role that can be occupied or passed on. In some classical myths, we talked about it. The kingship being passed on, current God stepping down or being usurped. It's reflected in works like The Sandman, where gods can be replaced, or in Preacher, where God willingly abdicates his throne. And the narrative revolves around who might replace him. And in the Marvel universe, figures like Odin and Thor hold godlike roles, but actually, like in Marvel, which is kind of cool that we never could see in quote classic Norse mythology, the all-father role gets taken by Thor. So, but there's been in ancient mythology the idea that God is a role or a position, or at least a relative one, like you're God in this universe. But if we're talking the multiverse, you're the state God. So that's nice. We talked about multiverse and omniverse concepts, where already, I think. But these are explored in things like in DC Comics and Marvel, the presence or the one or the source or the one above all. They used to be the highest head honchos and the cosmic hierarchy of DC and Marvel, but now there are omniverse things that are further than that. And finally, the idea of gods feeding on worship. In American gods, they quote lesser gods. are no longer being worshipped, so they're not feeding. But Clive Barker's Imagica feeds the idea that even the creator God, explores the idea, even the creator God needs to be fed by worship or will wither and die. And in some instances, there can even be ideas that maybe there's not a God, but eventually enough people believing in a one creator God comes together. So, and sometimes knows that they're not the creator God and sometimes thinks they are. And that can mimic the demiurge that I think is on another slide. This is the most controversial slide. So is Yahweh always God? Yahweh, Islam basically pushes forth the idea that Allah is that one Godhead. There's no question about it. And Christianity and Judaism, of course, the same thing about Yahweh. And generally, Muslims all regard Yahweh and Allah as the same God. And a lot of most Christians and Jews do, except some who hold some Islamophobic sentiment. So Allah is almost universally portrayed always in Islamic writing as having the omni qualities, including omnipotence and omniscience. The concept of Allah was born after these Greek ideas of the unknown God collided with Yahweh's mythos in Christianity and Judaism, once he was clearly the all God. So there was never a version of Allah that didn't have these things, because at least the belief in him as widespread, I'm going to stop disclaimers at this point, is born after these things are solidified. People say the Quran is more consistent than the Bible and has fewer contradictions. Well, of course it does. It was written by one man, maybe with some help over one lifetime, versus the Bible, which was written over centuries by people with different agendas. So, of course, the Quran, it's just logical. Just to mention, Allah is not a moon god, as some extreme right-wing Christians point out. But however, Muhammad did briefly, at one point, apparently believe, according to the Quran itself and some scholars, and then later retracted this, that he had three daughter gods, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. So that's the one not being stolen alone. That's the one really challenge to Allah. But Allah was basically born in a time when this idea of an omni everything God was already around. Yahweh was born well before it. And again, he was just once one of the Canaanite Ugaritic gods, and a lot of the biblical passages come from the transition. So Yahweh can't locate Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden until they come out and say, "Here we are," and he realizes they've eaten of the fruit. He can't defeat men with iron chariots, which we'll talk about later, and is defeated by the god Shemosh, god of Moab, in combat in 2 Kings. Lack of omnibenevolence. The reason not is just disobedience, but also the reason is after eating of the tree of life, or after eating of the tree of knowledge, Yahweh doesn't want Adam and Eve or humanity to eat also from the tree of life, because they'll also become gods. In actuality, then what the serpent said, who can't be the devil, by the way, because the devil later on in the story of Balaam and the golden and the talking ass, which we'll be talking about, and the book of Job, is still God's lieutenant. So the serpent didn't actually lie. Like, I ate the fruit and I didn't die, and if you eat both fruits, it'll be great. But God just stops them and kicks them out. So it's partially disobedience, partially also because if they eat the fruit, he'll have fellow gods to do it with it. And so I don't know. That doesn't seem very beneficent. And it's basically the same thing with the Tower of Babel, right? There's no commandment he's given. Don't build a tower that reaches heaven, but if they do this, there's nothing. If they finish this, there's nothing they won't be able to do. So again, freaks out and destroys the tower and scrambles the languages. Actually, I don't remember. Does he destroy the? No, I think he destroys the tower, or maybe he stops them from completing. The sea serpent Leviathan, who was regarded as a primordial being from which the reality was made, as the creation narrative around Yahweh is changed to state very clearly that he made it and he made it for his pleasure. What that means is some scholars say that means for his concubine. And now this might be an offensive thing to say about Yahweh, but back then it was to show his authority. No. This isn't a precursor primordial. He created it and answers to his beck and call. She's just his concubine. So it was actually, by the people that wrote that, meant to show reverence and how powerful it was, even though God creating a sea serpent to be his lover, some DDLG stuff is now sacrilegious. it wouldn't have been back then. And we'll talk about Balaam the sorcerer apparently has the capacity to summon Yahweh against his magic, summon Yahweh against his will with magic, which he doesn't do, but but the Book of Numbers indicates Balaam has the capacity to do this. And Yahweh's Verler is further revealed when he in the wrestling with the Book of Job, when he has to break the rules they've agreed to of the match and break Job's bones. I think break his hip bone. He does win, but Job holds it off a long time, and he has to win by cheating. So he has to become like Stone Cold Steve Austin or Hulk Hogan to beat Job. So it's that omnibenevolence or omnipotence. Just a note on Yahweh, the pronunciation of Yahweh probably is Yahweh. It's true that the vowels in Hebrew are lost, but there's this push to make the name more mysterious than what it is. It's probably linked to the root word Hue, meaning he blows, which is not sacrilegious. He blows the bellows. He was probably a forge god. Later were replaced by the god Kothar, which I may not be saying right. If there's any Assyriologists or ancient Near Eastern studies people out there, feel free to scold me. Similar to Hephaestus in Greek mythology. So these abstract interpretations of Yahweh meaning like I am who I am or I will be what I will be, as indicated in Exodus, are probably this chance to make the name more mysterious and epic and not just another god with another name. But it probably really is just pronounced Yahweh. Definitely not Jehovah. That's no one thinks that's a real pronunciation until the Middle Ages. And it probably simply means he blows. He blows the bellows, blows the forge, which is a perfectly legitimate, respectable thing to the ancients. And the only reason I gave Yahweh and all of this special attention is because in our society there is this push. We really want you to think of our gods as the one and only God, or else. So have they always been? It's up to you. Before we get into killing gods, why killing a god or a killable god why is it bad? I mean, it seems obvious, but we've questioned some things. A singular, all-powerful God provides a sense of comfort and security in the chaos of existence. There will be an afterlife. Although you can have an afterlife without a God. You don't need one for it. It follows naturally in most people's minds. And that there's an unquestionable right and wrong. And if God can be killed, that can be undermined, right? Completely undermined. So sense of safety and security and stability. But also linked with order and control. If a killable God maintains divine order, giving believers a framework for understanding their place in the universe, a killable God threatens this order, suggesting that there is no ultimate control or authority, and if God can be overthrown, who else? Anybody can do it, right? If God can be questioned, anyone can be questioned. So essential and situational morality, statecraft often prefers a singular definable God because it allows for a legalistic rather than farm benefit ethos. Ethos, if you're not familiar with it, is the spirit of the thing. If when you say that technically violates the rule, even though that's not how it was meant, it's the sort of other points of technicality, the ethos of a thing. You technically might be enforcing the rule, but when you enforce a civil rights statute to say Walmart can build in this town, whether the people want to or not, you are definitely not enforcing the ethos of this anti-racism law, even if somehow by the wording you're enforcing the technicality. So, and again, we talked about situational morality, where you have to do your best to be an arbiter in your best heart of what is right and wrong, because there is no ultimate right or wrong. Society doesn't like that. And in all honesty, it is tough to run a society where it says do your best. You kind of have to have some kind of rules. But in ethos and existentialist morality, the rules are constantly adapting to do their best to be based on when harm is created or when benefit is done. In essentialism and in Kantianism, it's merely the violating of rules themselves or the disobeying of commands that does it. And so if God is killable, the state needs these rule technicality-based ethos, technicality-based morality, rather than ethos, to keep things running. And if you can kill God, what rule can't you question? And again, challenge to divine and mythic authority. Again, that pyramid of beliefs that the king or the president in proper order and morality derive their place from that. And at one point, the king was thought the divine right of kings means the king was appointed by God. She's saying Henry shouldn't be on the throne. You may as well be saying Christ isn't God. So you don't know how deep that went. It's question really earthly rulers. And then statecraft. And I think this is on another slide, but we'll do it here. Statecraft refers that the path to the other world of the divine should be through whatever the proper prescribed method for accessing the divine is, right? The anthropological witch is simply when you try to access the spiritual realm or spiritual powers, not through what the dominant culture prescribes. Anthropological witch is always an outside. Anthropological witch is always the outside to whatever the proper means of access is. In ancient Rome, that was Christianity. And the accusations against whatever group are the anthropological witches is always the same thing. They kill children. They're sexually immoral. They engage in human sacrifice. They're wicked. And if you look at the accusations of the Romans against Christians, it's the same thing that the Christians in medieval Europe are levying against pagans and witches later on. But statecraft prefers this one path to the one true God. And if the one true God is killable, why should their path be the only one? So a lot of it has to do with basically all these are sense confident men. So why would you want to kill a God? No one is above justice. No one. Right? That feels good. Even a God can be held accountable. Taps into a very deep sense of justice. The trial of God at Auschwitz, which by the way, needs to be mentioned, occurred before obviously the Holocaust and the events of the formation of the modern Jewish state, and all the complexity in there, which had a heavy effect on the theology of rabbinical and Jewish thought. So the trial of God occurred during Auschwitz. Before they were killed, it's anecdotal, but Wiesel states that he interviewed people that it happened. They put God on trial and found him guilty, right? And is God guilty? Well, if he's a clockmaker God that put everything in motion, maybe he's not. But if he sets everything in motion, then maybe he is. They found him guilty and they sentenced God to death, the Jewish prisoner of war in an encampment. So this deep idea that holding a deity accountable for justice. And should God held accountable, this gets into the praise and blame paradox that, like, if God took his hands off the wheel at the beginning of time, or her hands off the wheel, or their hands off, then do they deserve to be thanked for everything that occurs? Right? If they're controlling everything, does that mean they deserve to get praise for everything that goes right, but never blamed? It's sacrilegious to blame God. But there's often this notion that, yes, gratitude for everything, but never blame. If it goes wrong, it's just what happened, or it's your fault. But God deserves praise for all of those. And it's often the same thing with the state. The state rarely admits its errors, and usually when the state does admit error, it's an earlier form of the government, like Barack Obama in 2012 or whatever it was, apologizing for something that the government did, not honoring Native American treaties in 1860. Rarely does a government, by extension of this kind of thing, this immutable relation between one true God and statecraft, admit it's present. Nothing is impossible. The notion that a God can be defeated or challenged, strangely hopeful idea. If the highest authority can fall, then what obstacle in your own life or dream you've given up God can't be rekindled, can be exhilarated. Pressure release. Being told that humans are inherently low and sinful and worthless, you can never be as good as God. No matter what you do, you'll always be shit, right? The best you can do is be in his presence. The act of killing a God releases us from this symbolic imposed hierarchy for worthlessness, right? Breaking royalty. We talked about the link between that. God is seen as royal, male, and absolute. For those that don't have that, as women, non-binary individuals, or even people that are just not monarchs, felling a God can feel good. The act of overthrowing or killing a God can be a gesture of reclaiming equality. The act rejecting the idea of this divine monarchy. Right? Sympathy for the devil, right? Prometheus or Lucifer. They're sort of like Lucifer are often portrayed as rebellious figures challenging and unyielding authority. Its narrative can resonate with people. You don't have to move the goalposts much to make Prometheus or Lucifer the good guy. By the way, that story's not in the Old Testament. It's not in the Bible at all. It's a legend that's not actually backed up by. There's no the Lucifer rebelling and falling nowhere in the. And Milton begins to explore right? Aspiration for equality. They're like, do we enjoy being told we can never surpass the supreme being? Which maybe a good supreme being would want us to become more supreme one day because they're that amazing and light, right? But to break free from the limitations of it. And the structures of monotheism and their hierarchy and all the shaming that has gone in them. The idea of killing a god can be like reestablishing our collective self-worth. So no, the idea that it would be thrilling to kill a god is absolutely kind of obvious. Just checking that no one's trying to get into Zoom and not everybody is in, it's going to be in. So finally, let's get to the killing of gods, right? There is the tarot card that I made. What if you drew that, God Slayer? Norse mythology, mortal gods. The Norse gods are mortal and can die, as seen in Ragnarok, where Odin and Thor meet their ends. There is some scholarship lately to suggest that Ragnarok is rather a late tack on to Norse thought when they were already trying to keep worshippers from converting to Christianity. It might not be that deeply rooted in Norse paganism, but it's pretty deeply rooted in our understanding. And Balder, I believe, in some versions even dies before them, dying and resurrecting gods. Tammuz and Inanna were thought to die and come back, symbolizing nature and fertility. Inanna's descent into the underworld. Cycles, right? So gods temporarily dying. Osiris is murdered by his brother Set and remembered and later sort of resurrected, but still Lord of the Dead, so resurrected in underworld form from presumably a non-existence form, and thus a ruler over the underworld. While Zeus doesn't die directly, right? He faces threats that suggest his mortality. Hera occasionally says, you do this one thing, because if we all get together, we could overthrow you like your predecessors, Uranus and Kronos. So there's a suggestion. And in one of the examples we'll look at, he actually does get killed from more. Well, kind of a liminal one between them. Demigods dying temporarily. Hercules has to undergo death so that his mortal half can die to achieve full divinity. Similarly, Jesus experiences death as part of the Christian narrative, because if Jesus is going to share his immortality with you, how can it come out? It comes out of him as the blood. So he temporarily dies, so that the sacred can become secular, resurrect, resecular again, reoffer you immortality. So it's this temporary death, right? In Canaanite mythology, and we're going to talk about this more deeply, but Yam, who's equated with Yahweh, is defeated by Baal using the Yagrush and Aimer. And nearly all scholars, except for, well, a good portion of scholars believe there's great evidence that Yam and Yahweh are the same deity, or were when the Baal cycle was written, although they're undebatably separate later. So there's a tradition where Yahweh can be slain. The myth of the fifth son, the Aztec gods, there's these cycles of the universe being born and reborn, really reminiscent of Hindu mythology. Nanahutzin, which I hope I'm saying right, that the sun has gone out and they need at least a sun to start a new creation. And so Nanahutzin, beyond just death, the gods are in this like afterworld for God's place, completely sacrifices himself to become a new sun, start everything again. It's kind of a cool way because he's like kind of badass. He, she, they. It's the gender of this god changes. So like, somebody's got to do it. And since none of y'all are, not a hootsing out. Enjoy new creation, mofos. So it's a really very cool god in mind. And the god Vitra is slain by Indra. In some ideas in Hindu mythology, Indra is slain by a god. Sometimes a god can be slain by another god. Not mentioned on here, but the Monkey King, Sun Wukong, can apparently kill Buddha or even the creator, even though he doesn't want it to. And in some cases, even Brahma goes by either to become a new Brahma or a new creator at an end of enough cycles or end of enough cycles of cycles. Um, and there might be something on my slide I can't see under this. The zoom is in the way. Let's just check. We're almost through, folks. We're almost to the meat of the stuff that you're probably here for. Let's go with some examples from media, some famous ones, right? Prometheus Unbound by Percy Shelley, which is where Prometheus gets freed. Prometheus is actually freed in some Greek works, usually by Hercules, but then usually apologizes to the gods. Well, in this, Prometheus doesn't apologize and overthrows Jupiter, who's Zeus. It's the absolute triumph of rebellion, right? It's a step further as a precursor, right, to full-blown the deicide of the creed. Right? Paradise Lost by Milton still says the devil is bad, but relatable. The Last Temptation of Christ is not about deicide, but it's really, we start to get into the mid-20th century where we see full-blown creator gods dying. But it's a step there, but it's actually a really beautiful expression of faith, because there's this idea that Christ, it's a notion of the church that God was fully divine and fully human, right? Well, we forgot about the part about Arius and the church, a lot about stuff about the nature of the Trinity. There's one of my favorite stories, and it's the question about eternity. God, it's worth going back to. Does the Son, as a person within the divine Trinity, S-O-N, Jesus, exist with the Father back through all time? If so, how does his birth work? And Arius is a bishop who believed that the nature of the Son, God the Son, was either subordinate or subsumed within the Father. Before that, the Nicene Creed that you recite is all these things about the nature of God that were really important to people. St. Nicholas of Myra didn't agree with it. Santa Claus, historical basis for Santa Claus, and he got into a fight with Arius on this because they disagreed that the Son had always existed in its present state prior to the birth within the Father, or went through a change with birth, but about the immutability of God. So that's worth going back to. I just mentioned that here. So the last temptation of Christ is this idea that Christ is fully divine and human. But if Christ is fully human, did he always know he was God? Did he know he was going to die and get resurrected? And how could he have uncertainty? Did he ever have an impure thought? If he didn't, how is that being fully human? So the last temptation of Christ is this, that Katsansos, if I'm saying it wrong, I apologize, which I love the movie with Willem Dafoe, my Christ went through all that, right? And God gives him a vision of coming down off the cross, passing on his mission, thinking he's enjoying a mortal life, a life as immortal, growing old, but then the world's not better without him. And he kind of hates God for wanting him to be crucified. And then at the end of this, he sees as an old man in this vision of what might have been, that the world is better if he does give himself, right? And it ends with Defoe, who's fought God the whole time, saying, I'm so glad, Father, that I'm your son. Because he finally really appreciates what he's doing. And to me, like, this is a much more compelling Jesus story-wise than like, let's let New York City pass out there. But it's a much more compelling version than what a Jim Caviezel and Mel Gibson's like, all is going to my plan. Weep not for me, for I will be resurrected. Weep for those who mock me. Like this edgelord version of Jesus in the Gospel of John and in some of the other portraits. Why do I care? He set the whole thing up and he orchestrated it, you know. But it's an important thing. God Emperor of Doom, Leto II, worth mentioning. It's just that even though he's not a classical god, there is definitely a god slaying moment, and in the early 80s that's coming along. So direct deicide, full-blown going through this. God of War, how can you mention Kratos, going after the Greek gods, you play as him, you're getting all your deicide out. It's a proxy deicide too, because you probably don't worship the Greek gods. That's what we'll talk about in a second. And then I think he goes on to kill some of the other pantheons. They safely avoid that. Supernatural, God is never direct. Chuck is never directly referred to as Yahweh, but he's got all the angels that end in El, so he's probably Yahweh. He's seen as not such a good dude. In the last episode, they don't kill him, but he does become mortal, meaning he'll eventually die. So it's definitely God usurping. And making you a man, Deicide. So eventually time and entropy are going to catch up with you. I'd say supernatural as the one true God. And there is no distancing Chuck from being Yahweh, even if he's not directly ever called Yahweh. Maybe he is. Maybe there's a supernatural buff out there saying that he is. But I give them that's a full blown direct Deicide. In Lucifer, again, God is never called Yahweh, but his sons are Michael and Lucifer, and they're kind of Yahweh if those are your kids. And though he doesn't die, his powers are given up and lost, and he's vulnerable in a moment, meaning that can happen until he's saved by Lucifer. So again, because of the potentiality for that, I'll give it to it. Final Fantasy, I was just going to mention as part of a genre, but Final Fantasy, there's these godlike beings called or summons that players can kill, challenging the idea of divine omnipotence. It's a recurring notion in Final Fantasy VII, for instance. The Sephiroth is a reference to it. We're going to talk about that more in a second. It is an Eastern god. There's a whole genre of god killing. So in the American gods, we've talked about the old gods and new are vulnerable. And I'm going to probably say if I'm saying it wrong, I'm going to say it wrong. But Kami Koroshi. It's a prevalent Japanese video game and anime genre known as god slaying. Revolves around characters defeating gods or godlike entities, sometimes that are machines, sometimes they rule a universe, making them the god. And there's a couple of animes where, like, they're used to their gods being involved. They're like, sure, put my god in a story. That's what they're for. They put the Judeo-Christian gods in. So there's a whole group of like power dynamic things where gods are killed. There's a whole genre. And I believe there's a subgenre where magical cat girls kill gods. And, that's if Japan never gave the world anything, magical cat girls killing God is no genre. So the proxy gods, right? Like it's not our god, but it is. Oh, and it's worth mentioning Hades Ascendant and others, a book, Ophelia Mythos book 2, ends with Yahweh straight out being called Yahweh. A coalition of Jesus and some pagan gods, along with the heroes of the novella, kill God, your Yahweh, who was once just one God, but now is kind of, sort of, mostly the one God of Earth, who's trying to become the one God of the universe. They stop him. He still exists in a diminished form after, though it's definitely a kind of death. So that's definitely a direct Deicide. Stargate series and movies, the Goa'uld are very Old Testament, though they're aliens for one, and they're aliens mimicking pagan gods. There are some great fanfics where Yahweh is a Goa'uld, but the series really petered out on that, where the character Teal'c goes, having read your Old Testament, where God is so noble, I know this could not be a Goa'uld. Anyway, but they're very Old Testament like, especially in the early series, and it's a proxy. Hercules and Xena. Because of this, Kevin Sorbo appears in the bibliography of my of this lecture. Because he's a producer on Hercules: The Legendary Journeys. But in that series, the Greek gods are slain, and then there's this proxy one true god named Deicide, who's also defeated, who's very Old Testament, very Yahwehish in parts, even having a possessed Aeolus, acting like a kind of crazy Christian preacher. But the series sidesteps this by having a episode where, even though Deicide is like a Yahweh stand-in proxy, Old Testament wrathful God, Xena meets the Israelites, and at one point she's like, this one God is not the one God of the Israelites, so calm down. So we're killing God. It feels good, but don't worry, it's not that. TV Tropes has a whole page of it. His Dark Materials, there's a lot of one true God Western monotheism around the Godhead being in there. However, the entity is depicted as not a true divinity, but definitely a proxy. Discworld series, the same things with that, where the gods are often mocked, but there's a sci-fi simulated reality aspect to both these series. Preacher we've already talked about, but of course we have to mention, and it's actually really cool timing, because Steve Shives, one of my favorite Star Trek YouTubers, just did a movie on Star Trek V, directed by Shatner. So Shatner and Kevin Sorbo, along with Immanuel Kant and Jean-Paul Sartre are in my bibliography for this. But there's this very Yahweh-ish energy alien thing that even claims to be Yahweh and the gods of several alien races, who's trapped on a world and has everyone except Spock and Kirk fooled. And even McCoy is like, it's God. Oh my God. God's like, I want to fill my message with your starship and take it beyond this barrier. And all William Shatner's overacting. All the other debate about whether that's a good Trek movie or not. And here I'm nothing but a full-blown Star Trek fan envy. What use does God have with a starship? Excuse me, but why does God need a starship? But it's a question about all these things. Oh, we need these donations, or even God needs you to not marry this person. Well, why? Why does God need this? So it's often been said, I say, and let's go. I don't know if there's a God that's going to judge somebody for being trans or their sexual orientation, but if there is, it's not a very important God, and you may as well try to fight him. If you've been judged sinful by God, if there is an afterlife, fight him. So our last slide, if you haven't checked out and been offended yet, wait, are we there yet? I think we're almost there. Don't worry, we're almost through. Oh. So what if you have to take Yahweh? What if the wrathful anger, not the practically noble version of Yahweh we see in, say, open theism, but what if that wrathful Old Testament God, what if he's going to send you and your family to hell? What if you have to try to take him out? He's already judged you. He's damned you. This is a tongue-in-cheek slide. And again, this is based on some inference. But garlic can kill vampires. This is where you learn how to kill gods. Garlic can get rid of vampires, silver for werewolves, and iron for fairies. So how do you take out Yahweh? Well, first of all, his angels. Right? So ancient Egyptians, some ancient Egyptian traditions, there was an oil called keres. There's the hieroglyphs for it. And you could put it on a dagger and kill an angel with it. This is the Egyptian understanding, obviously, not the Israelite understanding. And this is probably a later story among probably the Coptic Christians, actually. It's the Coptic Christians explaining why their ancestors didn't die out. So they fought back against the angels and they were saved. TV show Supernatural does something like this. I don't know if they actually use KRS, but you can put it on a dagger and it can kill angels. Any weapon can kill an angel if it's coated in KRS. By the way, 1 part Lebanon cedar oil, which there's still Lebanon cedars left. You can get it on the internet. 1 part sandalwood, 1 part myrrh, which would be easy to get. Asphodel honey, which I checked exists. Honey of the asphodel flower. Put them all together in the proportions on here. Everything being 1 part except the asphodel honey. You've got KRS, your angels. One of them is, and I forgot I have it. I have a little model of an iron chariot that's actually made of iron. Well, yeah, we were skipping ahead. Get another god to do it. In the biblical narrative, the god Shemosh, god of the Moabites, is depicted as temporarily defeating Yahweh, not slaying him. When there's a royal sacrifice made, when the king of Moab sacrifices his son to Shemosh, Shemosh is a full-blown god here and takes Yahweh out. It's not clear if Shemosh could have defeated him without it, but he temporarily kind of goes Super Saiyan. Of course, the apologists are like, it wasn't really Yahweh and Shemosh fighting. When it says that, it means they're peoples, but but at other times you're like, we should take it literally, right? But not this. So get another god, right? In Judges, the inhabitants of the valley cannot be driven out by Yahweh because they have chariots of iron. Why he can't drive them out, but it's a challenge to omnipotence. Maybe it's all iron. Maybe it's just iron chariots. I have a little iron chariot that I was going to have for fun prop, but I'm not going to get up and make you wait during this long one. In case Yahweh gets pissed off at me after the lecture, I have the iron chariot. But some people have speculated that iron, because iron often hurts supernatural beings, which may have something to do with the Iron Age replacing the Bronze Age and older beings being demoted to being daemonia, or doers or carriers of things, can be hurt by iron. But that's probably modern speculation. So maybe iron is a kryptonite for him. And then a friend of mine, who Adam in the back, who this is co-streaming on Geeked Out Podcasts when I mentioned this to him. This is not scholarship, but as a joke, said maybe Yahweh is a fae. And then I went further from that, which is totally tongue in cheek. Maybe he's like a Tuatha Dei, who is adopted fae pantheon, adopted by the Canaanite gods. And they gave him a rough upbringing. And so maybe all this trying to pretend he's the one true God and all this antisocial stuff, maybe you'd feel sorry for him because maybe they adopted him or fostered him but didn't treat him well. And, maybe he's not such a bad guy. Maybe that's why he was treated well. There's references in Numbers where the Israelites respect what Shemosh has given the Midianites, so you should respect what Yahweh's given us. And also, we should pick a neutral place to fight because Yahweh is supreme in the desert, Shemosh is on mountains. So there's this idea that location might matter even for Yahweh. And there's also in the interpretations where what it is that Balaam is going to do to stop him is trying to curse the Israelites by summoning Yahweh to a mountain, and the indication that Yahweh maybe can be summoned, and he doesn't want to be summoned there. So he sent, this is actually the first appearance by the devil in the Bible when he's still God's lieutenant, who he is through the whole Bible. God basically says to this wizard, is a good word for him, if that reading is right, which is kind of scholarly thing. Don't let Balaam summon me to a mountain. So the devil goes to a guy on his donkey and says, Yahweh doesn't want you to summon him to a mountain, even though you could, he'll be pissed off, and then there will be a punishment for it later. This is the devil telling him, so you better not. And Balaam's like, whatever. And then so his donkey starts talking and saying, you should listen to the devil. Even I see this is a bad idea. It's totally reinterpreted. I apologize. Yeah, this is not the only interpretation. But again, the implication in some of the wording is that if there had been a summoning, which doesn't occur, it would be to a mountain. So it seems that Yahweh may not do well on mountains. So if we're very literal with this, again, this is not scholarship, this is fun inference. Mount Sinai, which is Yahweh's mountain, presumably he's at full strength up to the top of his own mountain. But if Shemosh's mountain is Mount Hermon, 9232 feet, somewhere between 9497 feet and 9232, Yahweh starts to peter out. So just get him high enough. So a plane will do. Get him to follow you onto an aircraft. And again, Yahweh could possibly be summoned by magic. We talked about that in the book of Numbers. Doesn't say he could be restrained, but possibly he's vulnerable for that. And then finally, the Baal cycle. Baal cycle with Yahweh is equated with Yam. Again, Yahweh is not the creator. That's El. He wants to be king. Baal or Yahweh or El intends to give it to Baal. Is actually not his son, or his half son in some version. But Baal is seen as a better ruler. Yahweh kind of, quote, kidnaps his own mother wife. Asherah is confusing because sometimes she's Yahweh's mother, sometimes Baal's mother, sometimes they're wives. Sometimes there's more than one Asherah. But Asherah, whoever she is kidnapped. El is worried for her, so gives the kingship to Yahweh / Yam. Yahweh has Baal killed and sent to the underworld. He gets out with the help of his sister Anat, referred to as the beautiful and violent one. And apparently not even Yahweh, while he temporarily is on this throne, is going to fuck with Anat. Anat or Anath is the ultimate bad bitch. So Baal, she gets Baal out. Baal then battles sea serpents and various things. And with the help of his lads and lasses, who are like his human mortals, but who he's friends with, who he treats pretty well, he goes to Kothar, or sometimes the Kothar Wa Kassis, who has taken up Yahweh's form / Yam's former position as the forge god. And he's happy to have it. Yahweh didn't want it. He wanted to be king. And forges for him the Yagrush and the Aimer. One weapon, which is to take a god who has become the god and knock him down to just being the god, and then another one that can slay him outright. Driver and chaser. Which varies upon the telling. But I think if you really want to take a god out, especially a God who's going to send people arbitrarily to a bad place in the afterlife, your best bet is the Yagrish or the Aimer, or to become a god yourself. Those are the two best bets. But if you can get the Yagrish and the Aimer, the chaser and the driver, that's so. And then I'll just show you how many slides I have. These slides available. If you want to have these slides, please feel free to just email me. And I think I've made you sit through enough. I'll just ask the chat for a second if there are any. Let me end the. Let me just end the screen share if you don't mind. And there's my friend Ashley who is simulcasting this. Yeah, this will be available for everyone later. Just for a second, if anyone wants to put questions in chat, or if you're watching live watching at least, which is about noon Eastern time on the 20th or 21st Saturday. But if I don't see anything from Ashley, I'll assume there's no questions there. Yeah, and that's about it. I think this was a long one, an hour and 20 minutes, but I hope you enjoyed it. And again, it's an exploration of the notions of how we got to one God, how recent they are, how different those could be. Explore it in your own literature. Why might killing a god be good? Is it a proxy just for authority? So I hope these ideas did not offend you. They're ideas for exploration. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at COE Cat Oscar Empire at Proton Mail, Proton, Proton, like the particle, mail like postal mail, .ch for Switzerland. Like Cat Henry. So COE protonmail.ch. Email me your questions, or if you'd like a copy of these slides. And for those of you on YouTube, leave a comment if you like. It will be moderated comments, though. This will be my content, and due to the subject matter. Lecture felt cute. Might delete later. Thank you for coming, Ashley. Before I go, anything you want to add?
There were a couple questions.
Sure. Okay. Let's.
Okay. Regarding this is back to the tongue-in-cheek slide you had at the end regarding like how to kill a deity.
Right.
So you mentioned that God had a fear of being summoned. There's a book, The Lesser Key of Solomon, and it has rituals in which Solomon used to like supposedly summon demons. Now, do you know if that book and those rituals, air quotes, collected in there are actually from anything, or they're just like
I
spiritualism made up shit?
Right. I know a little bit about this. A lot of occultists will brusque at what I'm about to say. And again, I just want to point out I'm not an anti-occult person. I don't be like, oh, a lot of academics are like, respect religion. I love the occult. A lot of my ideas for stories come from the occult. I explore it myself. But what I will tell you is all books that survive to this day, which purport to be from Solomon, the Lesser Keys of Solomon, the Greater Keys of Solomon, were written in the Middle Ages. And the pedigree of Solomon having this authority over demons and whatnot is very much later. But what I will say, and also I'll just mention the Tetragrammaton, that Yahweh is supposedly not really the actual name of Yahweh. The real name in Kabbalah is a 72-letter name, is again a thing to make Yahweh sound more mysterious. The uncreation, if God's name is spoken backwards, that's from the movie Warlock, but has worked its way into the occult. But in theory, if you want to try to summon Yahweh, if you don't view him as the one true God, I would say, the true name is Yahweh. You can easily take the 3 letters, add them to the watchtower, add something, and I'm making this up. Like if I was making up for a story I was writing. Take a summoning ritual, take the Hebrew letters, then make a 5th glyph to be in the 5th position, depending on which elements you're using. Are you using earth, air, fire, water, and mind? Or are you using earth, air, metal, wood, water? And then put something that represents ultimate equality and liberation for all beings as the final glyph, and summon Yahweh. And you'll see what you get. So, but I don't think there would be anything even in those books that aren't true maybe where you could summon angels, and I think there are even maybe some things about summoning the what's it called, Metraton?
Metatron,
Metatron.
the
That's
voice
the,
of God.
that's the voice of God, which also is not a thing in even Kabbalah till the Middle Ages. That doesn't go back to ancient times. Although there are some occultists that'll be like, yes, it does. There's just it doesn't.
It's like, hey,
Um,
they made that up.
but I don't think. But there's also a weird thing in Kabbalah, whereas there's this Ein Sof, which is the pure uncreated form of God, where like we didn't talk about Gnosticism, which is where like it's supposed to, it must be like under my thing. Gnosticism is the thing where this belief that there's a perfect reality out there, like Plato's world of forms within a perfect God.
Mm-hmm.
But then accidentally an emanation from the perfect God in that creates a mirror of all creation, including a mirror of God that thinks it's God called the demiurge. Um, so the Ein Sof is in Kabbalah this unspoken thing, which is kind of like the original emanation. And in some cases, Yahweh may be a secondary emanation of the Ein Sof in some Kabbalah. So maybe you can summon Yahweh if it's an Ein Sof. But I would presume most of the medieval people writing the Solomonic keys, you could summon an aspect, but I don't think summon and control Yahweh against his will would be a thing you'd have medieval Europeans, whether Christian or Jewish, writing. I doubt it. I could be wrong, but it would be anathema because at the end of the day, they mostly were deferential to the idea of some unquestioning thing with no equal. So I think not.
Oh, we do have a pulp culture question from Adam in the back. Because so talking about supernatural, you brought up one of your Deicide examples.
But,
Chuck Refuer has the character Chuck, but also God's sister Amara. Do you know where that name? Does that name come from mythology? Is it from Sumer or?
I think it's, I might be getting it wrong, but I think it's an archaeological site. I think Amara might be a Greek name. I want to say, and this is totally, I know it is from something, but it's probably not a mythology so much as like a resonance thing. It might be the archaeology site where Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, but I could be totally wrong. That no, that might be a Marna. That's a Marna. I think it does come from something. But the idea of God having a sister is again might go back to Sophia. Um, because so if God of our reality is the Rex Mundi or the false mirror of the real God and the true holy reality, who sometimes is tragic, by the way, not some people. Some Sophia is that. There's also the Shekinah, which is sometimes the word, like like sometimes that, and there was nothing, but then God spoke the word, and the word was with God. Sometimes the word is the Shekinah, the feminine manifestation of Yahweh on earth, in some forms of more liberal Jewish theology. But the idea of God having a sister, or even some traditions, not so much Christianity, of like death, but God having a few primordial siblings, supernatural does definitely have footing for that. For Amara, you'd have to Google it. I know it's something. I don't think it's the name of a being. It might be, but it definitely comes from somewhere. But it's not Amarna. I was wrong about that. I think Amarna is the archaeology site of Onkanon, but I'm not an archaeologist. I have a folklore and the degrees actually in writing narratologies. I just saw a thing the other day where there was a guy being interviewed about economics, and and I googled his PhD because something seemed off. He was a geology PhD.
Oh,
Um, Go ahead. Sorry, that was a long, shitty answer.
no,
Oops.
that's fine. I'm not sure. Chat, shout out if you have any other questions you want to answer before we close for the night. The morning. It's not night. Oh my god. The day
Well,
has just started.
right. All right. Then if there's no more questions, I think we've held everybody for 90 minutes. I want to thank you for everybody that watched live, everybody that's watching on YouTube later, or on Twitch later, on my YouTube, or on Geeked Out's Twitch. And thank you very much. That's the love and hate relationship we have with Deicide. All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, all.
All
We'll
right.
catch you later.